Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. We'll start out with a brief mention of Jiroemon Kimura, who died recently at the age of 116. You heard that right, 116. This guy was born in the 19th century. He was the world's oldest living man, and here's an ITN report on Jerome Kimura.
A Japanese man who was the world's oldest living person has died at the age of 116. Jiroemon Kimura had held the title since December the 17th, 2012. He died in hospital following a battle with pneumonia. When asked on his 115th birthday what the secret to a long life was, he said it was thanks to the fact he was always looking upwards. I don't know exactly. Maybe it's all thanks to the sun above me. I'm always looking up towards the sky. That is how I am. Kimura was born on April the 19th, 1897, the same year Queen Victoria marked her Diamond Jubilee. He leaves 7 children, 14 grandchildren, 25 great-grandchildren, and 15 great-great-grandchildren. Japan also boasts the world's longest living woman, 115-year-old Miseo Ukawa, who lives in Osaka and who could now gain the title of the world's oldest person.
Guy was in his mid-40s when Pearl Harbor happened. Not much more to say about Jerome Kimura. We're going to move on now to Jerome Karle, who died recently at the age of 94. And Jerome Karle was a nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn who won the 1985 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his development of X-ray crystallography. X-ray crystallography is the science of determining the shapes of complex molecules by using X-rays, where the X-ray beam bounces off the crystal form of the molecule and produces a distinct pattern of light. And then with mathematical equations, that particular molecule can be identified. As I said, he won the 1985 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. His co-worker was Dr. Herbert Hauptmann. The interesting thing, his other co-worker was his wife, Isabella Karle, and she did not win the Nobel Prize, and as you'll hear in a minute, he was a little upset about that. His career path was that of a traditional one of a lot of poor but brilliant kids from Brooklyn. He went to Abraham Lincoln High School. He then went to CCNY in the early 30s when it was free and it was a hotbed of intellectualism and scientific discovery. He went on to Harvard. During the war, he was noted for his brilliance, so he was selected to go to the University of Chicago to work on the Manhattan Project. And after the war, he went to work in the University of Michigan. That's where he met his wife. She sat behind him in alphabetical order. And finally at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington. So in his career at the universities and working on the war effort, he was exposed to many of the most brilliant scientific minds of the second half of the 20th century. Here's an interview where he discusses, among other things, Einstein, his wife, and the Nobel Prize.
Einstein was very special. He saw and understood things that really revolutionized the understanding of what the scientific world was all about 100 years ago. He changed things. It took something of the order of 40 years of various people, good scientists, trying to find out whether he was right or not, and trying to find out what they could do with it. And they finally ended up with some very important practical applications. Now, the thing about Einstein was that he did things like that all his life. And when scientific developments come into a person's head, which are then passed on to others to think about, to work on, to develop, and if that comes or occurs time after time, then you have an example of true genius.
Is it important for the scientific world to be able to have people that one could relate to, the general public, to make us understand how important science is for the development?
Oh, I think that that's very important because, in effect, the public generally, through their governments, need to support it. I think that life would be very difficult for scientists if they irritated the public. No, but I think that the public understands with respect to medical questions. They don't relate generally to esoteric science, but they can certainly understand when there are new developments and understandings that will be able to make life safer and better for them.
In your personal life, in which way did it change after you received the Nobel Prize?
I don't readily change very much. There was a fun part. For example, since my institution is a governmental institution, the president of the United States called me up. We had a nice chat for a while. The fun part was not only the telephone call, but he invited me to, and my wife, to come to some of the big dinners that were held at the White House and that sort of thing. It was an opportunity to see things that, generally speaking, you'd never see.
I believe that you have worked with your wife for many years, and she's been
Yes.
very much part of your research and studies.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about the partnership that you two have?
What we did was that we continued a research problem that we had worked on while we were getting our PhD degrees. And we worked very closely on that. She is extremely bright, has all kinds of honors. In fact, I think probably if one went down the list and so forth, that she would have more honorary degrees and prizes and so forth. But she didn't receive the Nobel Prize, which astonished me, because we also worked on that together.
She should have had it as well together with you?
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the professors in Sweden who was responsible for the Nobel Prize was very outspoken about it. And he did something which is never done, and that is, after you receive the Nobel Prize, you're expected to visit universities in Norway and Sweden and give lectures. And he fixed it up so that she would accompany me and give her own lectures.
I read that you were part of working on the atom bomb, and your wife as well, I believe, then during those years.
Yes.
In general, afterwards, when you thought about that work, do you think you as a scientist have a responsibility for what you are creating?
I have a story about that. I worked at the University of Chicago. They had a special setup there. There were, I don't know, 6 or 8 major places around the United States working on the problem. And I can tell you that at one time, after it seems as if we were succeeding in making what we needed to make, we wrote a letter to the president and asked him to please not be the first one to use it. We thought that was settled. But as you know, that didn't happen. That was always a source of discomfort to me.
Well, like some other Nobel Prize winners, you'll remember Carl Weiss. His work was initially derided when he came out with it, but it eventually became the standard in his field. Today, X-ray crystallography is critical in identifying drugs and molecules that are used to develop new medicines, among other things. We're going to move on now to one of our 2 features tonight, and that feature is Bernie Sahlins, who died recently at the age of 90. Nice Chicago boy. He was the co-founder of Second City, and he can truly be called the godfather of improvisational comedy. Nobody discovered or promoted the early careers of more comedy stars in American history than Bernie Sahlins, among others. Bill Murray, John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, Tina Fey, Mike Myers. You get the idea. And in fact, if it wasn't for Bernie Sahlins, you could make a case there wouldn't be any Saturday Night Live, because so many of the stars graduated to Manhattan at Saturday Night Live. Although he started in the 50s promoting traditional theater in Chicago, it wasn't profitable, and he moved into a different niche, ensemble comedy with improvisation. In the late 50s, you've got the Beat Generation, you've got a lot of hip Kerouac types, and Bernie Sahlins tapped into that in the Old Town neighborhood in Chicago. And he put together a new form of theater with his partners Howard Alk and Paul Sills, and it was revolutionary. I'm going to read a little from the tribute that Chris Jones, the Chicago Tribune theater critic, did to Bernie Sahlins. It is hard to overstate Sahlins' influence on the growth and innovation of sketch comedy and on any entertainment that involves performers making things up based on suggestions from the audience. He was also famous for spotting big talents quickly and early. Bernie's track record for discovering future Hollywood megastars was unmatched, said Tim Kaczynski, one of Sahlins' numerous discoveries, a long list that included also the likes of Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, John Candy, Gilda Radner, and James and John Belushi. He was probably responsible for the greatest revolution in American comedy. You can't really exaggerate his contribution. I was a kid who came from the slums of Sydney walking into Second City, and that changed my life forever. And that was pretty much true of everyone who ever walked into that place, and everyone who worked there was part of Bernie's family. George Wendt, another comic actor who got his start in Chicago under Sahlins, said, Bernie was a mischievous imp with the mind of Bertrand Russell. Jones continues, he graduated from the University of Chicago, and he and Sills co-founded the Compass Players that had its roots on the campus there. If any single group could have been said to have invented improvisation in its current context, Compass Players was that group. And if any single individual could have been said to have invented topical sketch comedy, the form upon which Saturday Night Live and many other television shows are based today, Sahlins was that individual. Before Second City, he was co-founder and business director of the Playwrights Theater Club, which was composed of an especially talented ensemble including Mike Nichols, Elaine May, Joyce Piven, and Ed Asner. It did not last, and many of its members became part of Second City. But while some of the groups with which the young Sahlins were associated came and went over the years, Second City abided, with Sahlins' hand on the tiller for decades. He was also the co-creator of SCTV, the Canadian TV comedy series that grew out of Second City in Toronto and that retains its cult following today. Here's one of Bernie Sahlins' favorite quotes. He used to say this a lot.
Art is not a matter of life and death. It's much more important than that. We come, we go, art endures.
I don't think you can underestimate Bernie Sahlins' influence on the medium. Even today, it ranges from the satire of Mike Myers as Austin Powers, or the political satire of Stephen Colbert and Tina Fey. All this was originally derivative from Second City. Coming as it did from the late 50s, there was always a political anarchic quality to Second City. Here's one of my favorite Saturday Night Live bits from Jane Curtin and Dan Aykroyd, and it's right out of Second City.
And you self-important swine ass. There's no future for nuclear energy because 3 Mile Island taught everybody what some of us already knew. That nuclear power plants are time bombs ready to melt down.
Jane, you magnificently ignorant slut. Aren't the gas lines in California proof enough that the energy crisis is for real? Nuclear energy provides 12% of our nation's electricity. And who'd be the first to complain when the electricity goes out, Jane? You and your horde of promiscuous anti-nuclear heart.
Well, that's 35 years old. Tell me, you get a little bit of Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert in that old Dan Aykroyd bit? Well, if you do, in some way, Bernie Sahlins was responsible. We're going to move on now to Richard Matheson, probably the greatest science fiction writer in television history, who died recently at the age of 87. A true genius, he made his name in the Twilight Zone episodes, but he also did other great stuff, including the Duel episode of Steven Spielberg and the Omega Man. He got his start with his 1956 novel The Shrinking Man, which was made into the 1957 movie The Incredible Shrinking Man, a great sci-fi movie with a tremendous soliloquy about the meaning of life at the end.
And I felt my body dwindling, melting, becoming nothing. My fears melted away, and in their place came acceptance. All this vast majesty of creation, it had to mean something. And then I meant something too. Yes, smaller than the smallest. I meant something too. To God, there is no zero. I still exist.
Here he talks about the Twilight Zone.
I'm stunned that it has lasted so long. I think when people ask me why it's lasted so long, when a lot of the things from the golden age of television just seem terribly dated, is because the stories are so different and they are not, there's no time schedule, no time zone attached to them. They're just interesting, intriguing stories. You know, it's part of my writing legacy, I suppose. I'm delighted that I was a part of the Twilight Zone.
Here he talks about two of his greatest Twilight Zone episodes, Little Girl Lost and Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, and confirms that William Shatner's television version was better than John Lithgow's movie version.
When I used to read a lot of science fiction and fantasy, I might get an idea. And as I said, I got an awful lot of ideas from movies. But sure, in life, you're talking to your family, your wife, your son, your daughter. Some little thing is said, and suddenly you think, oh, that'd make a good story. Like little girl lost, that was something that happened in our life. Our daughter, our older daughter, Tina, was crying, and I woke up, and she wasn't on the bed. And I thought, oh, gee, she fell on the floor. And I felt on the floor she wasn't there. I thought, oh, my Lord, she went under the bed. I felt under the bed. I couldn't feel her. And I finally had to stretch all the way to the wall before I found her. She had rolled all the way to the wall. After comforting her, my first notion was, oh, there's a story. Both of Bill's Twilight Zone, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, I think he was just fantastic. I was on an airplane, and I looked out, it was all these fluffy clouds, and I thought, gee, what if I saw a guy skiing across that, like it was snow, because it looked like snow. And then when I thought it over, that's not very scary, so I turned it into a gremlin out on the wing of the airplane. And it was published as a novel at first. Then I sold it to Twilight Zone. The one who played it, if he hadn't had that costume, if they just sort of gnarled him up a little bit, looked exactly like the way I described him in my story, and it was Nick Cravat, Burt Lancaster's old partner. I mean, the one they had was, it looked like a woolly bear. And the monster in the movie was much better, although I didn't care for the way the story was done. Yeah, I wrote most of that script. Yeah, I didn't. Lithgow is a wonderful actor, and he did the best he could, but I think he was asked to do an impossible job to start at 100% hysteria and work their way up from that. Whereas when Bill Shatner did it, he was trying to control himself the whole time because he'd had a mental breakdown. And it was much more, I think, gripping them.
Here's Richard Matheson's advice to writers.
Be your own self. Don't try to imitate anything. You know, we all tried to imitate Bradbury. Fortunately, we outgrew it. You know, they always say only write about what you know. I think that's limited. I would say only write about what you're really interested in, because if you're really interested in something, you can do research on it and find out about it. Write from within, with emotion. Don't be superficial. I've gotten many letters. How do I start writing? What do I do? I don't know. I give them some gobbledygook answer. I know to myself, you're never going to become a writer, because if you're going to become a writer, you would never write a letter like that. I would never have dreamed of writing a letter like that. I was home in my cubbyhole writing myself, doing it my own way. I wasn't asking anybody, how do I do this? I was doing it badly at first, but then with more and more skill as time went on. I took writing courses at college, but they didn't teach you how to write. They gave you a chance to read your stories and let the other students react. You can't teach writing. It's just, as Ray Bradbury says, write a story a week for every year, you know, write 52 stories a year. When he started writing, he was not that good at writing. He made himself a good writer by writing and writing. You're bound to get better. I mean, if you don't get better after writing 52 stories in a year, you know, get a job in a factory.
And finally, on his own legacy.
Well, as a writer, as a storyteller, I've always said that's what I am. I'm a storyteller. Beyond that, I hope that they will say that I did change some of the thinking. When I think, though, and like I've gotten letters, like when What Do You Think came out, a person would write to me and say, my mother is dying, and she read your book, and you know, she was terrified of the whole idea of dying, and she read your book, and she's in perfect peace now. And I think, oh, that's it. You can't do any better than that as a writer. And I would like to have an effect on a lot of people, positive effect on a lot of people. Positive effects are what we need in the world.
I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. And tonight we're going to close with a brief mention of Ben Tucker, who was a great jazz bassist from Georgia. He died recently at the age of 82. For a long time, he played with the Billy Taylor Trio, and we did a long podcast on Billy Taylor about a year and a half ago. Ben Tucker was a great jazz man. He backed up Quincy Jones and Peggy Lee, among others. But his greatest fame came as a songwriter. He wrote one very famous song, and that song was recorded by Mel Torme, The Velvet Fog. So to close tonight in memory of Ben Tucker, here is the great Judy Garland introducing the great Mel Torme with a song that Ben Tucker wrote.
And now I'd like to present one of my most talented friends in a song that was a very big hit record for him.
I'm coming home, baby, now. I'm coming home now, right away. I'm coming home, baby, now. I'm sorry now I ever went away. Every night and day I lie go and stay. I'm coming home now. Coming home, baby, now.
You know I'm waiting here for you.
I'm coming home now, real soon.
You've been gone.
Coming home, baby, now.
You don't know what I'm doing.
I'm coming home, I know I'm overdue.